Now that we have our initial setup done, we're going to move on to doing our blockout weighting, and we're going to have to bind our character. So you may or may not have done this in week 1. If you did this in week 1, then this will be review on there, but either way that means you just move faster. You got to know how to do this. So our first thing we want to do is select all our joints and then our geometry and apply a bind. So up here we have our ability to select by name. Make sure it's on select by name. If this guy's not here, you could check to see if it's been collapsed like this. And I'm going to say asterisk, which is shift 8, underscore, and then bind. And that should select all your joints in your character, like that. If you see any waist joints selected, then you need to do it again. That's the main thing, is you want to check to make sure none of those are on. So how binding works is you select all your joints first, then your geometry, and then we're going to bind it. So I select there, and we go to skin, and we're going to go into our bind skinned. I'm going to reset this. So we have a couple things we want to set on here. The most important one here is selected by joints on here, because that's what all the selection we were doing was set up for. Then we have our bind method. Now I'm just going to put this in closest hierarchy. There are different bind methods, and for a character, they're almost all terrible. So I'm just going to go into closest hierarchy, and when we go into blockout, we're going to be resetting this. Do not use heat map or voxel when you're going to be going and doing blocking out, because these, if you have any gaps or holes or non-manifold geometry, these will break. So I go into closest on hierarchy. Now we go through the rest of these. We're going to leave the same. I don't mind any of these. I normally I leave these on, but I do turn off max influences, remove unused influences, and colorize skeleton. Max influences is just saying how much you can weight to. I'm going to cover that later in a later podcast, but I turn off these 3 on here. This is the big one to turn off at this point. So I'm going to say bind skin. And now when I move the character, you should see the character move like that. See? Now, there's a lot of things going wrong on here at this current point. You see how the face is kind of moving on there? So our first job here is going to be to dump all the weights to one joint to start over. So this is like setting up a board game. We're getting the game of Monopoly set off at the very first piece, or Risk, or whatever game you're setting up with. So that being said, this guy right here is going to be our bind. So I want to go into my skin weighting, and the slow way of doing this is grabbing the skin, going up the skin, and then saying, I want to go into paint skin weights and go into the options for here. Now mine are going to be set to another set pre-fault, and we go from there. And you can see we can go through this. Now I'm going to cover this in a lot more detail in a later podcast, but I can go through my influences by clicking in here, like this. I can also jump to an influence by clicking on one of the joints and then sliding up on here. Now I will say it's a very common mistake is to accidentally move over here under lock influence, and it means it can't be weighted. So you see how the lock popped there, so be very careful about that. But this sometimes does break, so it's good to be able to jump in here and select your influences from this list. Another thing, a faster way of getting into this mode is to select the geometry, hold down right click, and slide. Now this sometimes does break too, so the slow way that I just covered, going up to skin and bind skin weights and going to the option, is by far the most reliable way of doing it, but the actual holding on right click and then sliding over is faster. Okay, so we're going to move to the hip. So I'm going to right click on the hip and select influence, like that. And now we want to actually flood all the weights to the hip. So I'm going to go into my paint operations. I'm going to say replace. You have to be in the solid brush when we're doing this. And then we have to make sure our value is set to 1 on here. Also our opacity is set to 1. I never changed this. And then down here we're going to say flood. Now doing this, what's going to do is the whole character is now not going to move except for when the hips move. But that's what exactly we want. So this is getting ourselves ready for doing blockout. In the next podcast, I'm going to go over and block out each joint.